Okay, I think we're ready to start what is our keynote lecture for our first day for this conference. We are actually at the end of our first day, which is unusual to have a keynote at the end of the day, but I was very keen to invite, and I'm really delighted that Professor Moshe Simon Shoshan agreed to our invitation when I sent him our call for abstracts, because I had a very animated discussion with him about questions of citizenship and women's citizenship in the Talmud before I left Israel on one of my visits. And I knew that he was doing really interesting, and he is doing very interesting work in this area. And so, Moshe, we have a room full of about 30 people here in Canberra, Australia, who have all been distributed with your source sheet. But we are also going to put into the chat function, or you have already. So for everybody who is online and Zoom, it should be in the chat function, the source sheet that Moshe has prepared for this keynote speaker. And I think without any further ado, it is over to you. Thank you, Moshe.
Okay. A minute.
Great.
There we go. Okay, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. This is the third continent I've addressed without not even leaving my home, but not even having to go downstairs. Okay. Okay. So the share screen is up. You can see it, right?
Yes, we can.
Okay. The question of Jews as citizens throughout history is consistently tied up in questions of conflicting identities, obligations, and loyalties. This conflict might best be understood as one between two types of communities and the social and cultural forces that underlie them, described by Robert Cover in his seminal essay, Nomos and Narrative. Cover describes, on the one hand, strong forces, which are constituted by culture-specific designs of particularist meaning. These world-creating forces are responsible for the type of community he calls a nomos. Such communities are based on, in his words, a common body of precept and narrative, a common and personal way of being educated into this corpus, and 3, a sense of direction or growth that's constituted as the individual and his community work out the implications of their law. They are held together by, once again in his words, interpersonal commitments that are characterized by reciprocal acknowledgement, the recognition that individuals have particular needs and strong obligations to render person-specific responses. Cover's paradigmatic example of a nomos is the Jewish community, which sees itself as bound by the halakha. On the other hand, Cover argues that, in his words, the universalist virtues we have come to identify with modern liberalism, the broad principles of our law, are essentially system-maintaining weak forces. They are virtues that are justified by the need to ensure the coexistence of worlds of strong normative meaning. The product of these forces is the civil community, which, once again in Cover's words, is world maintaining. In this model, norms are universal and enforced by institutions. In other words, the modern state. Cover sees these two forces and the communities and laws that emerge from them as interdependent and optimally mutually reinforcing. But he's well aware that in practice they're often in conflict. The particularistic and creative spirit of the nomos not infrequently finds itself on a collision course with the universalistic and order-focused agenda of the state. Throughout history, Jews have found themselves caught between the competing requirements of their own communities and traditions and the needs and demands of the multi-ethnic states in which they live. Just reading the Megillah on Friday, I realized it's a really essential theme of Megillat Esther and Purim as well. Cover identifies the world maintaining weak forces with the modern liberal state. Yet he insists on calling these forces imperial. This linkage between liberal democracy and empire comes into sharper focus if we consider the fact that one of the central legal institutions of the modern liberal state, citizenship, traces itself back to the Romans. Already in the Republican period, the extension of citizenship was deployed as an instrument of empire. By the end of that period, Cicero would declare that there can be no doubt that the most important foundation of our empire and the key source of the glory of the Roman people was that the citizen body should be expanded by the admission even of enemies. Emperor Caracalla's grant of Roman citizenship to all free individuals under the empire's rule in the early 3rd century CE marked a transformation of the concept of citizenship. In the words of Miles Levan, from the privilege of a minority of individuals and communities into the common property of all, or almost all, free subjects of the empire. The liberal European concept of citizenship thus has its roots in Roman imperial policy. As such, I think the place to begin our exploration of Jews and citizenships should be with the rabbis of the Mishnah and Talmud, who lived in the Roman imperial era. Though much has been written of late about the impact of the Roman concept of citizenship on rabbinic law and thought, as far as I know, the rabbis do not directly describe or engage this institution. However, they were acutely aware of the challenges posed by the potential issues and conflicts that could arise between their commitment to the Torah and the Jewish people and the demands and obligations created by Roman and other imperial hegemons. In this lecture, I'd like to explore the rabbinic traditions about Rabbi Eleazar bar Shimon's career in law enforcement in the service of the Roman Empire. Through these narratives, the rabbis explore the relationship between the rabbinic nomos and the values of the imperial state, presenting contrasting perspectives and concerns in a rich and nuanced manner. In the second part of this lecture, I examine the role which this aggadic narrative has played in halachic discussions of the laws of Mesira from the late Middle Ages to our own day. The tradition about Rabbi Eleazar's service to the Roman government first appears in the Palestinian Amoraic Midrash, Psiktat Reb Kahana, in the midst of an extended collection of tales about Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai and his son Eleazar. Rabbi Eleazar, the son of Shimon, was appointed to be an archi riparius, killing individuals who were deserving of death. So Rabbi Joshua ben Karcha would call him vinegar son of wine. He said to him, "Whom do you call vinegar son of wine? Did I not clear thorns that needed to be cleared?" He said to him, "Just like your father fled to Laodicea, you should have fled to the ends of the earth. Let the master of the garden cut down its thorns." The Midrash relates that Rabbi Eleazar was appointed to the position of a senior or chief riparius, a sort of police officer, someone in charge of public order. We are told that this job involves killing individuals who are deserving of death. In making this statement, which is later repeated by Rabbi Eleazar, the narrative appears to making an absolute claim. Not only were these individuals deserving of death in the eyes of Roman law, they had committed capital crimes by the standards of the Torah as well. The Midrash then presents a dialogue which gives voice to two opposing perspectives on such activities. Notably, nowhere in this passage, are Rabbi Eleazar's victims identified as Jews. As such, the account does not explicitly raise the issue of a direct conflict between doing one's job as a Roman official and loyalty to fellow members of the Jewish community. At this stage, the discussion is about the inherent legitimacy of participating in state-sponsored violence aimed at keeping order. On the one hand, we have Rabbi Eleazar. He defends his behavior with two claims. First, he argues for the social utility of his activities. He compares his work to clearing thorns. If one does not do so, the thorns will damage the crops and ultimately overrun the area, making all agriculture impossible. Similarly, killing criminals is necessary to protect law-abiding citizens and prevent an ultimate breakdown of the social order. He then makes a moral argument. In repeating the claim that the individuals whom he brought to justice were in fact deserving the death penalty, Rabbi Eleazar presents his behavior as being inherently justified. Rabbi Eleazar thus presents the world-maintaining agenda of the state as reflecting values which Torah scholars should readily identify. Rabbi Joshua, in contrast, calls for complete disengagement with the state and its murderous machinery. Just one second. one should be willing to flee to the ends of the earth. Sorry. There we go. One should be willing to flee to the ends of the earth rather than take up a position in imperial law enforcement. He suggests that the punishment of criminals and the maintenance of social order should be left to God. It would appear that Rabbi Joshua is arguing that, despite the admitted social utility and inherent morality of the state's world-maintaining activities, such concerns are not the business of humans, or at the very least of Jews. We might argue that Rabbi Joshua rejects the legitimacy of any legal or social order not directly imposed by divine decree through the Torah. He might even be viewed as a quietist who rejects involvement in politics or history altogether. This passage lays out two rabbinic perspectives on Jewish involvement with the state and its use of violence to maintain order and justice. It does not explicitly decide between the two and appears to express a fundamental ambivalence regarding the behavior of Rabbi Eleazar and those who would follow in his path. The Babylonian Talmud presents a much longer and more complex account of Rabbi Eleazar's work for the Romans than that which we just saw in the Palestinian sources. This narrative appears towards the beginning of an extremely long aggadic section found at the opening of the 7th chapter of Bava Metzia. 7th chapter of Bava Metzia deals with labor and employment law. The first Mishnah concludes with regard to the rights and obligations of day laborers and their employers, particularly regarding working hours, when the workday begins and when it ends. Halakha does not impose fixed standards. Rather, everything follows local custom, literally the practice of the city, minhag hamedina. The Talmud opens its discussion of the Mishnah by citing Reish Lakish as ruling that day laborer is in fact obligated to work until nightfall and return home only after dark. However, in the morning, he need not leave for work until the sun has already risen. To back up his claim, Reish Lakish cites Psalm 104, 22 to 23. In order to fully understand Reish Lakish's interpretation of these verses, as well as subsequent understandings of them later in our passage, it is necessary to see them in their wider context. He made the moon to mark the seasons, the sun knows when to set. You bring on darkness and it is night, when the beasts of the forest stir. The lions roar for prey, seeking their food from God. When the sun rises, they come home and couch in their dens. Man then goes out to his work, to labor until the evening. How many are the things you have made, O Lord? You have made them all with wisdom. The earth is full of your creations, right? Ma rabu ma'asech Hashem, kulam b'chochma asita, malah haaretz kinyanech. In these verses, the psalmist celebrates how the heavenly bodies keep time for the world and establish a natural rhythm for life. Wild animals roam free in the night, whereas humans toil during the day. The fact that men awake at sunrise to go to work and work until dark is presented here as being part of the natural order, in sync with the heavenly bodies and the behavior of the animals. In effect, then, Reish Lakish is arguing that expectations of workers are determined by a sort of natural law, which does not require them to rise before the sun, but does mandate that they work until dark. The Talmud challenges Reish Lakish's natural labor law with the Mishnah's ruling that labor law is entirely local and conventional. The Talmud seeks to resolve this conflict first by attempting to find a community that has no inherited customs and as such exists outside the state of nature. A labor market in which people from numerous cities come together to seek out employment is such a case. Alternatively, the Talmud suggests that the natural law of the Torah is relevant only as a linguistic marker in the world of conventional law. An employer can stipulate that a laborer must work according to the standards of the Torah. The Talmud then moves into its aggadic mode and goes on to present another interpretation of these verses, which reads them metaphorically as presenting a very different sort of divine order. The night is understood as representing this world, and the wild animals are the evildoers who dominate our world. The humans are the righteous who receive rewards for their labors only in the next world. This reading presents a very different image of our world. Rather than the orderly world of the psalm, in which the forces of chaos and destruction are relegated to the night and hardworking man rules in the day, here, this world is one which is dominated by the forces of evil. All the righteous can do is to continue to do the right thing and await their reward in the next world. There is no possibility of imposing order or justice on this world. We now begin our story. Rabbi Eleazar one day meets a pregavna, apparently some sort of royal official. In this case, we're told that he's in charge of catching thieves. This is one of several Persian loanwords in the story associated with the powers of the king. This gives the putatively Roman setting of the story a distinctly Sasanian flavor, reflecting the imperial milieu in which the Babylonian sages found themselves. Rabbi Eleazar challenges the man as to the feasibility of his job. First, he says that thieves are compared to wild animals. He cites the verse that was being discussed before, once again reading it metaphorically. The animals are no longer evildoers in general, but thieves who literally work at night, as opposed to law-abiding citizens who work during the day. The Talmud suggests another Psalms verse, this time from Psalm 10, which Rabbi Eleazar may have cited instead. He lies in hiding like a lion in his lair, waits to seize the lowly. He seizes the lowly as he pulls his net shut. This verse is the advantage of explicitly referring to evildoers as metaphorical wild animals, as predators. I would suggest that this verse is the basis for the metaphorical reading of the other verse that we saw both from Rabbi Eleazar and from the previous interpretation. Further, this entire psalm presents a very different world than that of Psalm 104. It opens, "Why, O Lord, do you stand aloof, heedless in times of trouble? The wicked in his arrogance hounds the lowly. May they be caught in the schemes they devise. The wicked crows about his unbridled lust. The grasping man reviles and scorns the Lord. The wicked, arrogant as he is, in all his scheming thinks, he does not call to account. God does not care." This psalm does not present a magnificent natural and cosmic order presided upon by God above. It portrays a human world in which God is absent and evildoers roam free. At this point, it seems that Rabbi Eleazar is challenging the very viability of the imperial effort to impose order and justice to the world. Criminals are wild beasts for whom puny humans are no match. Perhaps in light of Psalm 10, he's suggesting this is a result of God's absence from our world. All we can do is hope for him to return so that he can restore order. Rabbi Eleazar then makes another argument. He questions not just the feasibility, but the morality of imperial justice. He asks how they can be sure that they are not punishing the innocent. This term very much resonates, I think, in our own contemporary world with DNA tests and all these people going free. Once again, Rabbi Eleazar is challenging the legitimacy of the imperial order. The man answers, "What can I do? It's the king's harmona," which means the king's decree, or perhaps more broadly, the king's authority. It's not clear what the man means exactly. Is he just saying, "I'm just doing my job"? Or perhaps he's saying he'll be punished by the king if he doesn't do his job. But maybe he's arguing that the imperial order is a justified end in and of itself, as it provides for order and stability, though it may at times lead to otherwise immoral actions. One way or another, Rabbi Eleazar recommends to him that he go to the market at a time when the people are eating their mid-morning meal and see who's dozing over their wine. If they're Torah scholars or day laborers, then they have risen early to study or work, or perhaps they work a night shift. But if they don't have any alibi, then the person should be arrested as a thief. This method appears rather absurd, but the story appears to make clear that in the world of the story, it actually works. I think this needs to be understood in the context of the discussions of Psalm 104 and its interpretation earlier in the passage. The verse states the natural order is that people are active and work during the day, but the nighttime is for wild animals, which Rabbi Eleazar understands is referring to robbers. Then, in order to separate the guilty from the innocent, we need to identify those not quite human individuals who are nocturnal. This is not so simple. There are exceptions to this natural order. As we saw at the beginning of the sugya, some workers actually do rise before dawn to go to work. There are also Torah scholars and night workers. In devising his method for identifying thieves, Rabbi Eleazar is applying his knowledge of Torah, which allows him to understand both the natural order and the exceptions to that order. Rabbi Eleazar takes the initiative and offers his service to the authorities. He sees a potentially mutually reinforcing relationship between Torah scholars and the work of the state in bringing order to the world. Human kings lack the knowledge to bring about this order on their own, while Torah scholars lack the resources. Working together, they can succeed in overcoming the forces of darkness, represented by the nocturnal robbers. Rabbi Eleazar at first envisions only a limited partnership with the authorities. He offers a one-time consult to set them on the right track. He does not plan to get his hands dirty, apprehending or punishing criminals, but he quickly loses control of the situation. Word reached the royal court. It was said, "Let the reader of the letter become the messenger." They sent for Rabbi Eleazar, and he proceeded to arrest the thieves. Rabbi Eleazar now finds himself appointed a criminal investigator in charge of catching thieves. The Bavli story has now reached the point in the plot at which the Palestinian account begins. It then proceeds to present its version of the exchange between Rabbi Eleazar and Rabbi Yoshua ben Korach. Rabbi Yoshua ben Korach said to him, "Vinegar, son of wine, how long will you deliver up the people of our God for slaughter?" He said to him, "I remove the thorns from the vineyard." He said to him, "Let the owner of the vineyard come and remove the thorns." Well, this exchange is quite similar to the one found in the Midrash that we saw earlier. There are a number of critical differences. First, the exchange is not carried out face to face, but by messengers. It seems that in taking this position with the Roman government, Rabbi Eleazar has separated himself physically from the other rabbis. Already his new job has in some way alienated him from his colleagues. Next, in his response to Rabbi Joshua, Rabbi Eleazar does not make the claim that those he has killed were liable for the death penalty. In this case, they're guilty of theft, certainly not a capital offense according to the Torah. This is raises the stakes for Rabbi Eleazar's position. He's asserting the world maintaining violence of the empire is justified, even when it is not called for by the Torah. But the most critical differences lie in Rabbi Joshua's words. He accuses Rabbi Eleazar of handing over God's nation to be killed. According to this new formulation, Rabbi Eleazar's actions are not simply unjustified or even immoral, but represent a fundamental betrayal of the people of Israel and their God. Here, Rabbi Joshua frames the issue as a conflict between Rabbi Eleazar's obligation to his nomos, the community bound together by common history and laws, and a profound sense of mutual responsibility, and on the other hand, the demands of the order-speaking state. Rabbi Eleazar believes that the need to maintain order, both in the world at large and within his own nomos, override his obligations to the other members of his nomos, and justify his obligation in state-sanctioned killings. On the other hand, Rabbi Joshua believes that the nomos must always triumph against the state. At least in such cases, the quest for order and societal justice is a divine and not a human responsibility. Also, in using the term moser, the verb moser, Rabbi Joshua alludes to the halakhic and ethical categories of misirah, or the moser, discussed elsewhere in the Talmud. A Jew is forbidden to hand over a fellow Jew or his property to Gentiles. Such a person is a moser, and is condemned in the strongest possible terms as being not only worthy of death, but as having no share in the world to come. The exact parameters of this prohibition are left fairly ambiguous in the other sources. Here, Rabbi Joshua appears to include even turning over Jews who are guilty of severe crimes to legitimate government officials, at least in cases where they're going to be executed. This passage sums up the fundamental conflict underlying traditional Jews' relationship with the state and its law enforcement apparatus. On the one hand, we have the Jew's commitment to his or her fellow Jews, their community, its laws and practices. On the other hand, we have the need for order and justice that can only be provided by the state, not only within the broader society, but within the Jewish community itself. At this point in the story, the two claims appear to be locked in a stalemate, reflected in the standoff between the two rabbis. But the story continues, further complicating the picture. One day a fuller met him and called him Vinegar, son of wine. Rabbi Eleazar's activities and Rabbi Joshua's attacks on them have apparently undermined Rabbi Eleazar's position of authority within the community. Even a common washerman feels free to hurl at him the same invective of Vinegar, son of wine, previously deployed by Rabbi Joshua. Even if justified, Rabbi Eleazar has paid a price for his work. Rabbi Eleazar's reaction is even more revealing. Rabbi Elazar's gut response is that person who speaks to him with such chutzpah must be truly evil. And so he has the man arrested. Rabbi Eleazar soon calms down and regrets his rash behavior, but it's too late. The man has already been executed. Up until this point, the question of rabbinic involvement in the imperial justice system has assumed that only the guilty are being punished, and that indeed rabbis can help ensure that this is the case. Nevertheless, Rabbi Joshua finds such collaboration unacceptable. Now we face a very different concern, that of the morally corrosive effects on the individual of engaging in state-sponsored violence. For one brief moment, Rabbi Eleazar abuses his power to settle a score with an enemy. Even if helping the state to execute justice is a worthy rabbinic activity, the temptation to abuse one's position is too great. Rabbi Eleazar's well-meaning involved in the state's duty to bring order and justice ends in tragedy. Watching Rabbi Eleazar sob under the gallows makes one wonder if perhaps Jews are better off staying out of government service and leaving the business of law and order to God. But the story doesn't end here. Instead, it takes a sharp turn away from political realism towards the fantastic. His disciples said to him, "Master, do not grieve, for he and his son seduced a betrothed maiden on the Day of Atonement." Rabbi Eleazar learns that, amazingly enough, the person whose death he caused was a degenerate of the first order. Even in his self-centered rage, Rabbi Eleazar has meted out justice. Rabbi Eleazar credits the intuitions of his belly, which, as we shall soon learn, is prodigiously fat. His flesh is truly righteous, and as such, he claims, it will be impervious to decomposition in the grave. Rabbi Eleazar's prowess as a crime fighter are no longer rooted in his understanding of the natural of human orders, rooted in his Torah study. Rather, he relies on the supernatural intuitions of his gut. Once again, Rabbi Eleazar's confidence turns to distress. Rabbi Eleazar is plagued by doubt and guilt. He cannot be sure that he is not guilty of murder. Only after his death will it be possible to truly determine the righteousness of his body by determining if it decomposes. So in order to determine his status while he's still alive, Rabbi Eleazar has buckets of fat cut out of his stomach and placed in the sun to see if it rots. It does not rot. His flesh is not mortal. It is some manner superhuman. Here ends the story. On the one hand, Rabbi Eleazar is vindicated. His involvement with the machinery of imperial order did not tarnish his righteousness and resulted only in justice being done. Yet it also appeared to suggest that for most Jews, taking on positions of state authority may not be a good idea. For even Rabbi Eleazar turned his power against a fellow Jew for personal gain. It was only his supernatural abilities that saved him from committing murder. People who lack these abilities and function only in the natural and human realms perhaps cannot afford to risk their souls by becoming part of the state. Furthermore, a few pages later, the Talmud once again picks up Rabbi Eleazar's narrative and declares that even after this experiment, Rabbi Eleazar was still unsure if he did the right thing and was racked with pangs of conscience. And he continues to undertake extraordinary acts of physical penance to atone for his potential sins. Finally, the Talmud follows the account of Rabbi Eleazar's liposuction with another brief narrative. A similar thing befell Rabbi Ishmael, son of Rabbi Yosef. Elijah met him. He said to him, "How long will you deliver the people of God to execution?" He said to him, "What can I do? It's the royal decree." He said to him, "Your father fled to Asia. You flee to Laodicea." This scene reworks the original exchange between Rabbi Joshua and Rabbi Eleazar that we saw in Sikhat Rav Kahana, along with elements of the Bavli's version that we just saw, with another Palestinian tradition found in Bereshit Rabbah and the Yerushalmi, in which Elijah the prophet rebukes Rabbi Joshua ben Levi for handing over a Jew to the Romans. This narrative once again presents a standoff between an individual who sees collaboration with the authorities as a betrayal of the Jewish community of God, with one who sees such service to the state as being justified. But there are a number of new aspects to this presentation. First, the anti-statist, pro-nomos view is put in the mouth of none other than Elijah the prophet, who is given the last word in this entire long passage. This seems to imply that Rabbi Joshua was correct for opposing Rabbi Eleazar Rav Shimon in the previous story, and that Rabbi Eleazar should have fled rather than work for the Romans, just as Elijah instructs Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael also introduces a new, more radical argument for serving the state. In arguing that he's clearing out the thorns from the vineyard, Rabbi Eleazar merely argued that the ends of the imperial agenda to impose order and justice are aligned with the interests of the Jewish community and the values of the Torah. It does not suggest there's anything inherently authoritative about the imperial legal system and its agents. Rabbi Yishmael, on the other hand, argues that he has no choice because, as the Gentile officer said to Rabbi Eleazar at the beginning of the story, he was subject to the harmina de malka, the decree or authority of the king. In this context, it's clear that this is a moral argument. Rabbi Yishmael cannot be arguing that it's permitted to kill other Jews simply because a Gentile king says to do so. Rather, he appears to be saying that there is inherent legitimacy to the imperial legal order, and that he is obligated to follow it even if it leads to the execution of fellow Jews. This coda to the longer story thus presents the most forceful claims for and against collaboration with the state and its agenda to impose order and justice. This entire Talmudic passage constitutes a layered and nuanced multivocal meditation on the problem of if and how Jews should serve as active citizens in the realm of law enforcement. It twice prevents the fundamental conflict between nomos and empire in dialogue form. It further considers this question in the broader context of the interrelationship between the natural, human, and divine orders. Finally, it raises more pragmatic questions of imperial justice, such as whether the state can reliably determine guilt or innocence, the divisive impact of the community of a rabbi serving as an officer of the state and ultimately killing fellow Jews, and finally, the corrupting nature of political authority and the potential for the individual to abuse their license to kill for their own interests. The Talmud here does not engage in a halakhic analysis meant to resolve these issues in general or any specific case. It merely explores the complexity of the problem. This sort of explanation is fine for a work of aggada, or perhaps even theoretical halakha. But the world of psak, actual halachic decision-making and rulings, cannot tolerate this sort of surfeit of possibilities and meaning. The work of the posek, that like that of a judge, is focused on what Cover calls the jurispathic function, the need to eliminate possibilities and ambiguities so that problems can be resolved and conclusions can be reached. What remains of my time in this lecture, I would like to take a quick look at how this complex literary text was interpreted by poskim throughout the generations in rulings regarding the laws of Mesira, the prohibition against the turning over of Jews or their property to Gentiles. As far as I've been able to determine, through most of the Middle Ages, this story was not cited in discussions of the laws of Mesira. It seems they simply didn't see this whole crazy story as being an actual legal precedent that could enter into a serious legal discussion. Halachas therefore focus on other Talmud sources which are more clearly legal and in some ways more clear-cut precedents. But in the late 13th century, Rabbeinu Shlomo ibn Aderet, Rashba, penned an extensive responsa justifying the handing over by other rabbis of a particular individual from Barcelona to the royal authorities for execution. As part of his argumentation, Rashba makes some sweeping claims regarding the authority of kings. First, regarding halachic due process, he declares, for all these things regarding the rules of evidence and criminal procedure were only said regarding the laws of a Sanhedrin, based on the laws of Scripture. Regarding the laws of secular governments, Dina de Malchuta, we do not concern ourselves with such things, for their law only follows knowledge of the truth. One can be executed according to the laws of the king, even by the testimony of relatives or even through self-incrimination, without warning and without 23 judges. For the law of the king only follows knowledge of the truth. Because if you said otherwise, and held all courts to the laws of the Torah governing the Sanhedrin, the world would be desolated as murderers and their ilk would multiply. Rather, it is certainly as we have said, whoever is appointed as such by the king can judge and do so as according to the laws of the kingdom, because through these laws, the king sustains the land. Rashba argues that not only is the authority of the state independent of the Torah's laws, but that such an arrangement is necessary, because the Torah's laws are not sufficient to maintain order and ensure justice in the world. In our terms, The nomos is not self-sufficient, but depends on the imperial order for its very survival. By alluding to the biblical verse, by justice a king sustains the land, Rashba affirms that the world-maintaining work of the state is of critical moral importance and divinely sanctioned. Rashba then goes on to offer his interpretation of our Talmudic story. Even greater than this argument is the fact that Rabbi Eleazar of Shimon apprehended thieves and evildoers. Sorry. Even greater than this argument is the fact that Eleazar of Shimon apprehended thieves and evildoers by the authority of the king and punished and killed them. And so did Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Yosef. Rashba reads our story not as a multivocal meditation, but as a clear-cut legal precedent, deciding in favor of the position of Rabbi Eleazar and the authority of the state. In order to do this, Rashba needs to contend with the counter voices in our story. And even though Rabbi Joshua ben Korcha said to Rabbi Eleazar, "Vinegar, son of wine, how long will you deliver up the people of our God for slaughter?" And Elijah said the same to Rabbi Yishmael. Nevertheless, they did not compare Rabbi Eleazar and Rabbi Yishmael to those who completely erred regarding explicit rulings. Rather, due to their righteousness, they should have refrained from killing those who the Torah does not require the death penalty and the like. In calling them vinegar or son of wine, they did not mean to say they meant to say that they were not practicing the same level of piety like their fathers. For if they were entirely mistaken and acted in violation of the law, they would not have called them vinegar, son of wine, but rather wayward evildoers. Rashba argues that the positions of Rabbi Joshua and Rabbi Elijah are not legal rulings. Rabbi Eleazar's and Rabbi Yishmael's actions were indeed permissible, but unworthy of great sages like them. This argument allows Rashba to marginalize the positions of Rabbi Joshua, but still doesn't get us to Rashba's contention that collaborating with royal justice is the moral thing to do, because otherwise the community would be overrun by evildoers. So he then makes a weird turn and effectively undermines his own claim that Rabbi Eleazar's behavior was unworthy of a great stage, returning to the story. He goes right on and says, "Heaven forbid that great sages of Israel and supremely righteous individuals like them should be so characterized. Indeed, Rabbi Eleazar of Shimon tested himself and came out like gold." Rashba now argues that it's impossible to describe Rabbi Eleazar as a flawed sage, which is exactly what he said in the previous paragraph, who did not live up to his father's standards, because as the story itself makes clear, by presenting the experiment demonstrating the incorruptibility of Rabbi Eleazar's flesh, that Rabbi Eleazar was the ultimate saint, completely blameless. Rashba thus attempts, perhaps not entirely successfully, to tame the complexities and ambivalences of the Talmudic narrative, to establish Rabbi Eleazar's collaboration with the Romans as a paradigm for rabbinic cooperation with the imperial machinery of justice throughout his history. Rashba's actual response to them was not published until the late 19th century and wasn't really widely available until well into the 20th century. But Rav Yosef Karo, in his Beit Yosef, cites extensive excerpts from this responsum. Thus, though Karo himself rules against Rashba in his Shulchan Aruch, he introduced Rashba's position and his reading into our story into halachic discourse. As a result, Rabbi Eleazar's behavior and worldview took their place as the basis of a school of halachic thought which embraced the Rashba's position and the importance of cooperating with government authorities, even if it means handing over a fellow Jew. Most recently, in a 2004 responsum, Rabbi Yosef Shalom Elyashiv, at times certainly the leading halachic authority in the ultra-Orthodox world, applied a broad reading of the Rashba and his interpretation of the Rabbi Eleazar story to permit reporting suspected child abusers to the authorities. Notably, Rabbi Elyashiv repeatedly identifies the underlying authority for such action as tikkun olam, which in its precise halachic meaning refers to the conservative, world-preserving function of the liberal state identified by covenant. In contrast to the Rashba's reading of our story, at about the same time and not far away, Rabbeinu Menachem HaMeiri presented a very different interpretation. In the section of his Beit HaBechira addressing our Talmudic passage, he writes, scholars, pious men, and men of God must, under all circumstances, take great care not to report individuals to the government, and certainly not to accept an appointment to capture robbers, bandits, and other evildoers of the generation, and hand them over to be killed. For whomever does this causes many individuals to be killed by the law of the kingdom, and not the law of the Torah. And whoever brings about another's death according to the law of not according to the law of the Torah, such a person is among the informers and Mosrim. As they said to one of their great ones, how long will you deliver up the people of our God for slaughter? And even though he apologized for his actions, saying, I removed the thorns from the vineyard, they responded, let the owner of the vineyard come and remove the thorns. The Meiri understands our story as ruling in favor of Joshua and Elijah. Though at first he hedges, and like the Rashba states that cooperating with the authorities is only inappropriate for the righteous. In the course of his argument, he declares that working with the government as Rabbi Eleazar did is a grievous sin. Meiri completely rejects the legitimacy of the state's efforts to mete out justice. He champions the values of the halachic nomos and the mutual commitment of its members to each other against outsiders, most supremely expressed by the prohibition of Masir. The Meiri's work was not published till the 20th century, the Beit HaBechira at least, and as such, his interpretations of our story and the rulings that flow from it had little direct influence on the halachic conversation over the centuries. Nevertheless, the Meiri is part of a long tradition, both prior and subsequent, which takes a very hard line against reporting fellow Jews to the authorities. This group includes Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, perhaps the single most influential posek of the second half of the 20th century, certainly in America. These scholars tend not to engage our story, relying more on other sources. However, in a 1990 article, the great halachist and legal scholar, my teacher, Rabbi J. David Blythe, sought to argue that, in fact, the entire history of disputes regarding the authority of the secular state in halakha is rooted in this dispute between Rabbi Eleazar and Rabbi Joshua in our story. Blythe thus attributes the Meiri's reading of our story to a significant body of scholars throughout history, including Maimonides, even though many of them did not cite this text at all. Finally, there are also many scholars throughout history who seek a middle ground, embracing the tensions in our story between Rabbi Eleazar and Rabbi Joshua, between the demands of the state and the needs of the nomos, permitting Masir in some cases and forbidding in others. Notably for our purposes, Maram Shik in the 19th century and Rabbi Moshe Halberstam writing just a few years ago present a much more nuanced readings of our story in formulating their conclusions, which is much too long to get into in the limits of this lecture. So, at the heart of the story of Rabbi Eleazar and Rabbi Shimon and the halachic discourse on Masira that emerges from it lie central tensions and concerns regarding Jewish participation and collaboration with the secular state, between universal liberal values of order and justice and particularistic imperatives for self-preservation and loyalty to God's revealed commandments, between the weak forces of empire and the strong forces of nomos. Thank you very much.
Wow, great. Now, thank you very much, Moshe. That is such a that represents such a significant preparation on behalf of the conference. So I want to first thank you for that and the handout and the extent of scholarship that has gone into this particular presentation. I'm going to try and make it so that you can see the, let's see, the gallery view. It's just showing us up. And so I
see everyone.
You can see everyone. It's just in our room that
people don't have their cameras on, but yeah, I can see them.
Okay, we're seeing some of the cameras coming.
Fantastic. Now.
Excellent. Okay. That's great. So we've got 10 minutes really available to us to call for questions either from the room, and we have one immediately from the room from my co-convener, Sarah Charik. So Sarah, I might ask you to come up just to hear, and so that I can change that for others to see. And then I'm going to go into, if anyone has a particular question, to ask it of me as the AAJS Room 1 presenter. And I'm going to just change this around so Sarah can ask you directly.
Hi.
Hi.
That was really
glad to see you in person, as it were.
Sorry.
Glad to see you in person, as it were.
Yes. You received many emails to me. Yeah, so thank you. That was really, really interesting. I guess one's a comment and one's a question, which is somewhat specific, but I hope you'll entertain it. So first, I suppose a really interesting observation about like the function of stories in rabbinic literature, which allow for completely opposing halachic views, which use the same story to substantiate where they end up. So I think that's really interesting, and I know that you've worked on stories and the law generally, but that's your overall kind of focus. So that's a really interesting thing to think about. And the question is about the view of the Meiri, and I was kind of surprised because my biggest exposure to the Meiri is his much more liberal views of the society in which he lived. So he famously thought that Christians were not idolaters, and therefore he took a much more liberal view about interactions with Christian society than some of the other decisors in his generation. So I was sort of surprised to see that he had taken a much more hardline view about this Masira issue. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Only that I was surprised also. He also famously dismisses a claim, I believe it's really in the Yerushalmi, that women can't be trusted to check for chametz. I don't want to stress anyone out right after Purim, but that women can't be trusted to check for chametz because they're lazy. And he interprets that to mean that the women have been cleaning the house all month, and the men suddenly come and check chametz in Erev Pesach, and they do it, but the women know they've checked already, so they don't take the mitzvah of doing it right for Pesach seriously because they know they've gotten rid of the chametz. Yeah, he has a reputation as a free thinker, as a liberal and free thinker, and I've often wondered if that's why his books weren't transmitted. But yeah, he's particularly radical. In another place, he actually says that you can't even be Moser or Moser, which in fact is the Rashba's case. In other words, even if someone is being Moser people to the government, you can't turn that person over to the government to be executed.
Yeah.
He's really radical on this. It is interesting. I've wanted to speak to my friend and colleague Pinchas Roth, who's an expert on provincial scholarship, but it's not really my field. So I don't, but you're absolutely correct. He has a reputation as a liberal with some justification.
But specifically on this question about like government and society, because his observation about Christian society is that there are laws and morals, and for that reason, we can interact with them in a more liberal and freer way than Talmud says. And if that's his view of Christian society, then why does he take this view?
Exactly. He's more, right. I had the exact same question, and it just shows us that the Meiri, like all great thinkers, is more complicated than we like to think. Like I said, I'd like to speak to Professor Roth about this, but I haven't gotten a chance because, like I said, I have no real expertise in the Meiri.
Thank you.
So, yes, good point.
Are there
anyone else? How's this working?
Yes, there's and one more here in the room. I'm just trying to take this glare out a little bit more, so maybe.
So thank you so much for a wonderful, wonderful presentation. And I'm just to take issue with the use of the word liberal about the Meiri. I mean, liberal is not a particularly useful term here because you presented a theory about the difference between the that fence around the Jewish view of itself versus the view of the large environment in which Jews lived, that doesn't when you were surprised that the Meiri had a view about the environment that they lived in that was liberal, that doesn't mean that you cede authority of your own community to the outside world. That's not the same theory. It means that you have a view of the outside world that is benign, but it doesn't mean that you let your view of your own jurisdiction, your own authority over yourselves out to the outside world. I mean, I don't know the Meiri either, but I don't think it's a contradiction to say that the Meiri didn't think that the outside world was evil, to say that he still believed that the outside world should be segregated from the world in which it lived on, that the Jews retained their own jurisdiction over themselves. So I'm just wondering if you could speak that this seems to go very well with your original theory of the strong versus the weak view of jurisdiction, or it's greater than jurisdiction, view of the selfhood of the Jew.
Oh, yeah, just a minute. There I am, I'm back. Yeah, Viva, I'm not arguing. First of all, I use the word liberal very loosely in my comments, and I should have done that because I use it very technically in my talk. Yeah, I don't think that it's a stira. I don't think a halachist would say, how could you say this and say that? Just in a question of our general expectations. And clearly, and this would involve a real investigation, which looking into it, I realized I understood less than I did. about exactly the Meiri's actual political situation. And I'm actually no longer clear. He's considered a provincial scholar, but it doesn't seem he actually lived politically in Provence. So it seems they actually lived in under the Castilian kingdom, just like the Rashba. So I'm actually looking into this. I've actually become more unclear about it. But absolutely, there's no actual technical stira contradiction here. It's just our general attitude and expectations of the Rashba. It's not, and which just makes me curious to have a better understanding. Moshe Halbertal wrote a whole book on the Meiri, which probably would be the place to look, and I have not read it. But that's, yeah, no, absolutely. It's not a kasha. It's just an observation and a somewhat surprising thing, particularly in this other passage where he comes out so harsh that he does sound deeply suspicious of anyone outside the community. But once again, you have to separate attitudes from halakhic analysis, and not.
So do you think that there is a more practical, and I'm not using a technical word here, a more practical explanation for the attitude of the various jurisprudence developers in this area, that if you do not tell on your dog, or what we call snitch on your friends and neighbors, then the authorities will be more harsh and come in and insert themselves into your judicial system? Is there some theory about the view of the authority of the Jews coming as a result of the fact that they do tell on Dob or Moser, their neighbors, and as a result they retain some kind of authority over their own people? Has that been developed?
Like I said, this is really at the very beginning. I just sort of said, oh, I've always wanted to write about this, so I'll take this opportunity to give this lecture. I was sort of generally aware and had thoughts about this. And that's really, I didn't see that expressed anywhere in the sources that I saw, but it seems quite likely that in terms of the political and social calculations, that's part of what's going on. I've certainly, let's put it this way, in certain issues, I don't want to get into too much of the politics of, but certainly when these issues were quite burning a few years ago in the New York area, I certainly heard such ideas referred to, such theories expressed. In fact, a prominent lawyer who I spoke to, a close relative of mine, referred to the prominent rabbis who were taking a hard line on Masira. She thought of them as, in fact, as most endangering the Jewish community because of the fact that they were actually undermining our autonomy by not ceding to the authorities when it was clearly necessary and part of our social contract. So yeah, I think it's very feasible, but I didn't see it actually reflected in any actual halakhic argumentation. And it's not exactly the sort of argument I think that would come out of the sources, though obviously a poststate could always throw out a social or political consideration. Yeah.
I've checked on my chat here, and I don't appear to have any questions that have come directly to me from the Zoom participants. Just going to check, have you received anything, Frank? So I think we've had some very spirited discussion. Perhaps to close it off, it's and having started this morning in terms of situating ourselves as individuals, as citizens in the nation state, and the ways in which that intersects with notions of political and civil and social participation and identity, I might just finish us off to bring it back a little closer to home, to think about all of our own individual responsibilities as citizens towards one another in the context of law enforcement. And it has been, bringing it back to the Australian context in the last couple of weeks, a quite powerful period, not so much in terms of Jewish identity, but in terms of gender and the reporting of crimes that occurred here within Australia. And I don't know if it's been reported in Israel, but of allegations of rape that occurred just literally hundreds of metres away from here in Parliament House, and that the Australian Federal Police have come out and made comments about the fact that if individuals don't report those, that it makes their role in enforcing law enforcement in society more broadly difficult. And of course, on the issues for individuals who choose not to report when the particular offender then goes and offends again without, in that context. And perhaps that's a broader, sobering way to finish off about not only our responsibility towards our fellow Jews in respect of that balancing act between protection and individual responsibility, but also in that other forms of intersection of identity or experience that that is relevant to all of us in our lives.
I just want to note that in basing myself on Cover, who in some way has Jewish source in the background, but is fundamentally not concerned with Jews.
Yes.
And he's concerned with all sorts of other communities. And these dynamics are universal dynamics, really.
Yes.
And we see this with all sorts of closed groups, not just other religions. In America, you had it with the Boy Scouts. And once again, you have these in terms of maybe you could see women and men almost as nomoses,
yes,
competing nomoses to some degree. So these
yes,
are really, he's also identifying larger social political phenomena beyond even the legal context. Forget about the Jewish context. So
yeah,
for sure, this points to much larger, more universal questions.
yes. And so for that, we thank you very much for illuminating
Most
it with
welcome.
the Talmudic influence, and thank you to all of the people in the room. And we'll send you some photos, Moshe, of the room as it is. You've got the Zoom sense here, but I'll send those afterwards. And thank you for your contributions to this conference.
Thank you very much.